Welcome everyone. This is Balkan Devlen, and welcome to this interview and talk on scholars working with on existential risks and global catastrophic risks. Today we have Dr. Luke Kemp from the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the Cambridge University. Dr. Kemp looks at both the past, that is, as civilization collapses, as well as the future, the climate change and the emerging technologies, to guide the policy at present. He is a research associate at the Center for Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge. He's also an honorary lecturer in environmental policy at the Australian National University. And he holds a PhD in international relations from ANU as well, and was previously a senior economist at Vivid Economics. So you can see a broad set of affiliations and background. Luke, thanks for coming on, and thanks for taking time with us.
Thanks for having me, Balkan.
So let me get to the point very quickly. Could you tell us a little bit about your own background and how you end up being interested in the study of existential risk?
Of course. So I originally had a background in human geography and international relations. They were the kind of two main majors I had in my undergraduate. But I actually took an undergraduate called a Bachelor of Interdisciplinary Studies, where you had to take at least 2 courses from every faculty. So that gave me quite a wide-ranging, eclectic education. And during that time, I ended up being part of a student delegation, which attended the Copenhagen Climate Conference back in 2009. And that piqued my interest in looking at international climate diplomacy and international climate negotiations, which was something I followed through my PhD as well. My PhD looked at how to manage US participation in environmental treaties, since the US has a really long and illustrious track record of basically signing but not actually ratifying agreements, or doing neither. And as we all know, the US is actually quite pivotal to making agreements work. When you look at the Ozone Treaty, for example, that really hinged upon US leadership. And thereafter, I was a lecturer in both climate and environmental policy for about 3 years back in Australia. And during this time, during one of my courses, I had to give a final lecture that was supposed to be more uplifting for the students. And so we're both focusing upon activism, but also upon a more technological solution, which was geoengineering. And geoengineering kind of became my gateway drug into the world of existential risk. So by looking at geoengineering, I came across the broader literature on global catastrophic risks. And I really started to think that even if we solve climate change, which I think is pivotal, we still have a basket of other risks that you have to address. And it kind of crystallized in my mind that we're trapped in this Pokemon problem, that you have to catch them all. If you decarbonize the economy by 2050, but then you have a nuclear war shortly thereafter, it's still not exactly a good situation. It could still plausibly result in human extinction. So that was more or less what really piqued my interest. And then I, after a while, started working with the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, which essentially brings me to today.
Okay, excellent. I mean, that seems to this broader background and quite an interdisciplinary work seems to be quite common on scholars who are working on this. And I guess one of the reasons is that the problems itself are quite multidimensional, and it's very hard to get it from only one single perspective. Taking on what you just said at the end about, we need to you get them all right, but given limited resources and concerns about that, if you need to prioritize, if you are more concerned about and there's some limited time that you can devote and limited resources you can devote, how would you sort of rank, not necessarily perhaps rank, but what risks are you more concerned about today?
Yeah, so typically when I get this question, people I think are always pushing towards ranking hazards. So when you think this gets made up of 3 components: a hazard, a vulnerability, and exposure. So think about it this way. If we had an asteroid strike the Earth, the hazard, of course, is the asteroid itself. But the exposure is the fact that it hits Earth rather than going past Earth. And the vulnerability is the fact that we don't have, for example, deflection equipment, nor necessarily recovery mechanisms in place. And so while I will give an answer to the hazards, I think it's actually more important to think more broadly when you try to categorize risks. So if I was trying to do it in a really typical way of thinking through what are the main hazards that we should be concerned about, I'd probably be quite traditional and say up the top would be nuclear war, closely by climate change and other global environmental problems, followed by a biologically engineered pandemic, and then I'd say the kind of near to medium term risks from AI. So actually for me, it's less about super intelligent AI or misaligned AI, and much more about the way that artificial intelligence technologies could be deployed by malicious actors or even just existing institutions in a very, very precarious or malicious way. So think about, for example, already what we've seen, the rise of surveillance technologies in response to COVID. So that's the kind of future scenario which really works. I think it's less likely to result in extinction per se, but could definitely result in a far less livable world. So that's the kind of list of hazards, but the way I like to think of it is much more in terms of what are the drivers behind this as well. And to me, up the top is just a lack of international cooperation. When you think of spoken about, all of them by nature are essentially international coordination problems. It comes the same when we look at nuclear disarmament, when we look at mitigation of climate change, or even, for example, controlling and regulating emerging technologies. The typical response you hear here is, well, we shouldn't do it because what if X country does it or Y country doesn't, and particularly if it gives them an economic benefit. So I think actually international cooperation ends up underpinning all the global catastrophe risks we're dealing with. And even the ones that are natural, whether it be a super volcano or an asteroid strike, the best way of course, addressing them is through some kind of coordinated collective response. So for me, international cooperation, or the lack thereof, comes up the top. And that would then be followed by most likely inequality and environmental degradation. So inequality seems like a very old one, right? But the empirical data we have here all points towards inequality, usually either driving socio-political violence over history and resulting in countries that have much lower both mental and physical health. And I think when we think about most catastrophic risks, they often spur from kind of conflict type situations. And I see inequality as being this kind of pernicious driver underneath, which pushes us either towards intrastate or interstate violence. And it makes the deployment of weapons or potentially dangerous technologies much more likely. And I think actually when we think about why we're building all these dangerous technologies, it comes down to some kind of class warfare to a certain extent. We're constantly being told we need to have more, that we have all these problems that can't be fixed by institutions or politics that have to be fixed by technology. And that's apparently why we need dangerous technologies, whether it be biotech or artificial intelligence. Of course, these do have some good applications beyond that kind of class warfare element, but I do think inequality has a very large role to play, both in the politics of why we create these technologies, but also in making kind of more dangerous societies where we're likely to use these technologies unwisely. So yeah, I think that's a very odd response for what we're expecting, but I think the key drivers here really are a lack of international cooperation, our relationship with the environment, and inequality.
I mean, some of these then can also be considered as sort of background risks, right? Or leading to cascading risk, especially in the case of climate change. Some describe it as sort of slow-moving disaster or similar terminology where, it is unlikely that we will have something like the day after tomorrow type, risk associated with the climate change, but that it actually exacerbates and makes everything else worse and thus could lead to a tipping point, including, I would argue, the cases of pandemics, particularly, but also, agential risks related because of the inequality in climate change and how that affects different communities differently, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I think it may not be as sexy to talk about as, say, AI, but having that climate change and inequality as the background that makes things actually worse, and perhaps can even shift some of the risks that could be regional catastrophic risks or more limited to a more global catastrophic and eventually perhaps an existential risk. So that's something
I like
important.
the fact that you use the term sexy there. That's actually a terminology that my friend Karen Kuhlman has used, the idea of
Okay.
sexy and unsexy risks. I actually prefer Hollywood versus non-Hollywood risks.
Okay.
And I
That's good.
kind of touched upon it there, that the idea of the very abrupt, dramatic, almost fireworks type explosion when it comes to either a killer AGI or a nuclear war is what usually captures public attention. But when you look at most risks, it's actually about the background conditions which lead to it. So even think of COVID right now. It wouldn't have happened as dramatically if a couple of things had not been happening in the background for a long period of time. And one is obviously what we call disease ecology, the fact that we have been incurring upon new ecosystems, which bring us exposed to new animals and makes zoonotic infections much more likely. We've had both poaching, international biodiversity loss, as well as wet markets, which create the perfect conditions for breeding zoonotic infections. And the world's become much more hyper-connected as well, whether it be for trade or for transport. And that made the transport and spread of a pathogen much quicker. Obviously, we've seen the defunding of both the CDC and the WHO, which has hampered much of the international responses. So it would be, I think, really amiss to think of this as a single once-off pandemic, which has kind of happened out of nowhere, when actually all the conditions have been breeding for decades. It's much more useful to think about those conditions because that helps you prevent the apocalypse rather than just trying to react to it when it happens.
I mean, I want to come back to the COVID later on in the talk, but I just want to make the sort of the comment that I don't remember who wrote it, but the argument that the old question was how fast the plague travels, as fast as the fastest horse or runs or the fastest ship sails. Now, as fast as the next airliner goes, and that hyperconnectivity makes things, I think, a lot worse. And maybe this, I mean, I want to come back to COVID later on, but a lot of these issues, I want to sort of pivot to one of the central problems in all scientific fields, and that is the issue of methodology. How do we get a handle on these issues which either didn't happen before by definition, because we are around, that we did not disappear, or have so low probability despite the high impact, and thus using sort of base rates and so on and so forth may not necessarily be very useful in engaging the risks and preparing for it. What methods you find in your own work useful, not only to study but also to get a handle in this?
There's two main statistical ways of approaching probability. That's the frequentist approach or the Bayesian statistics approach. And the frequentist approach can be useful when you're looking at risks that are naturally occurring and do have some kind of geological track record. So supervolcanoes, asteroid strikes are good examples of this. And we do have good estimates of those. And the best ones I've seen suggest the kind of background rate for human extinction should be roughly on an annual basis less than 1 in 87,000. So really quite low considered. So that's, I think, one area which is kind of easier to understand, at least in terms of understanding the probability. Of course, we then have to have a better understanding of the dynamics of these systems and how to potentially address them. And that's where you need to draw upon more kind of domain expertise. So in this case, geology when it comes to supervolcanoes. When it comes to more unprecedented risks, that's far more tricky, and you have to increasingly rely upon a Bayesian approach, which is essentially where you have a prior and you update that prior based upon new information. Which is still tricky because often the prior is highly subjective. And in my case, I think most people usually base their priors upon an ideology. And of course, we need to have a decent prior about what is the resilience of human society as well. And I think this is one problem that people don't address directly, is I don't think, how is society likely to react? How resilient do I think the modern system? I think one point where I differ from a lot of other scholars in the field is I think many scholars are very optimistic about how resilient human society globally is right now, while I'm, I think, a bit more pessimistic, particularly looking at how the world has responded to COVID thus far. So
what made you more pessimistic about the resilience? I'm in the same boat. So I tend to find, especially dealing with AI and other issues, most of the writings to be a bit too optimistic in how the society would react and deal with it. But maybe it's my sort of IR realist pessimism that comes in. But why are you more pessimistic? I'd love to hear more on that.
History.
Okay, exactly.
My background has been looking at history, particularly the both collapse and transformation societies. And when you pick out the different forces that tend to lead to societal collapse or transformation, whether it be inequality, climatic change, decreasing returns on energy, decreasing returns on complexity, all of them are things which I think are actually trending very poorly in the modern day. So when we look at inequality, the Palmer ratio, which is your kind of measurement of the top 10% versus the bottom 10 or 50, depending upon how you measure it, that's been worsening dramatically over time, both usually at a national level as well as at a global level. Gini coefficient within all major economies has been getting worse as well. An increasingly unequal, lopsided world, a more chaotic world. Obviously, climatic change has become very different. In the past, we know that climate change has been implicated in all 5 of the major mass extinction events in the Earth's Paleozoic history. It's also been implicated in a number of societal collapses and traumatic transformations, with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, what we call the Bronze Age civilization collapse, where we had about almost a dozen different civilizations collapse roughly in the same period of time, or in the kind of Aegean Mediterranean area.
There's a great book by his name keeps me exactly. Yeah.
1177, the year that civilization collapsed. Yeah, exactly. It's a fantastic. It's a good guy as well, so I can highly recommend it. And when you actually look throughout history, and this is part of a project I'm doing right now, and you look at variations in temperature in the climate over the last 5,000 years, as plotting against these kind of major collapse and government transformation events, you kind of waves where climate change periodically has oscillated roughly every 500 years with a couple of kind of periodic changes as well. And those actually map really well onto these kind of waves of state births and state collapses. So I think one thing we mistakenly think now is that we are totally and utterly disconnected from the natural world and disconnected from climate change as well.
Hubris.
Hubris to the highest extent. And when you actually look at it, like areas which right now have a mean annual average temperature of 28 degrees Celsius, there's only a few places in the world, most of them in the Sahara Desert, they don't have any built up infrastructure or kind of like really complex human civilization. And yet, if we get to 4 or 4.5 degrees Celsius, there's going to be a very large band around the Earth, which is going to be roughly mean annual average temperature of 28 degrees Celsius. And that's supposed to cover, I think, approximately 3 billion people or more. And I do think technology has a lot of applications and there's lots we can do with it, but also historically, when you look at it, technologies tends to create as many problems as it solves. And this is often the idea of decreasing returns to complexity, which is again one of the big theories of societal collapse is that we make society more complex, both for institutions and technology, to address new problems. But eventually, you start to reach a point of diminishing returns, where the benefits you get from technology or new institutions are actually outstripped by their costs. And eventually becomes just a good adaptation to simplify society. And this is an interesting take on societal collapse. It's actually not a bad thing. It's just a natural, intuitive adaptation to an overly complex and spiraling world.
That's kind of the basic argument of Thomas Homer Dixon, right? When
and he originally. I was just going to say he originally borrowed that from Joseph Tainter, who wrote about it in 1982. I think provides a much more modern, kind of more ready take on it. But the original ideas stem from Homer Dixon. Homer Dixon, his idea is a lot more around this idea of energy return on investment, which I think is similar but slightly distinct. Whereas complexity is broader, while Homer Dixon's more focused on energy in particular. And his argument is when you get initial sources of energy, they tend to be a very high return on investment. And this is essentially the ratio it takes to extract a resource versus how much you get from that resource. So think if you go to tap into an oil well, you need to have you need the personnel to work it, you need to have the transport infrastructure to ship the oil, etc. And that all takes energy in itself. And what we see, at least right now with fossil fuels, is the earliest sources we got to, so the very shallow lake oil in Saudi Arabia as well as in the US, they were incredibly high energy return investment because they were so easy to get to. They were easy to find geologically, they were very easy to tap into. It was just abundant energy. And so you often had an energy return investment of 50 to 1 or above. That's been declining over time, and we're increasingly having to move to more difficult to extract resources. And so you've seen the rise of shale gas, for example, which has been enabled by energy, but still has a lower energy return investment than the earlier fossil fuels. And Homer Dixon argues that this is actually something that's plagued all of humanity over time, not just the recent fossil fuel era. And he brings up a very poignant example of the Western Roman Empire, where when they expanded, the returns on investment were essentially the gold they captured, the slaves, and the booty they got. And that was quite a large energy return investment on their initial conquerance in basically the Italian peninsula. But the further afield they went, the more they had to spend on the military, the maintenance and upkeep of their soldiers, the roads, etc. And basically the less they're often getting from the conquering of far-flung territories. And eventually the costs of imperial maintenance were outweighed any benefits they got from those kind of much more far-flung conquests. So anyway, I think when you actually break down history into the different forces that cause traumatic transformations in societies, most of them are getting worse. And I think on top of that, we also just have a system globally which is much more hyper-connected, much more tightly coupled, and much more quick-moving. And we know that these systems in general are more prone to what Charles Perrow, a sociologist in the 1980s, called normal accidents. He studied nuclear power plants as well as aviation systems and many others. And his argument was when a system is tightly coupled, when one thing changes, another thing changes really rapidly in response, and when they're overly complex, it's just normal that eventually you'll have a catastrophe and an accident. It's something you can't foresee because the system's beyond your comprehension. And I think we've basically created a world which is both prone to normal accidents, but also prone to actually spreading them very, very quickly. So it's not a modular world as much anymore. So I think that's the two key reasons that really give me a certain degree of pessimism about the modern day society is when you think about complex systems, we've actually created the infrastructure and the structures which make us, I think, more susceptible to large catastrophes. And when you look at history, most of the different factors that have led to collapses and traumatic transformations are unfortunately worsening in the modern day world.
And do you also think that we don't have the recovery capacities is not really different than the previous civilization collapses, or do the current society have a better or worse recovery capacity after such a collapse?
I think we have a better recovery capacity overall, and this is actually somewhere where our technology definitely does help out. We have a better knowledge of, for example, how soils work, which makes it much easier to think about, how to adapt your crops or how to even recover your crops in the case of a failed season. And of course, ancient connectivity helps with this sometimes as well. If one area has a dust bowl and fails in a couple of years, it can very easily be compensated by other areas. I think there are several factors which balance this out. And I like to think of this as what I call the rungless ladder, that as a society crawls up the ladder and comes to harness increasing amounts of energy, it also becomes more risky for that society to fail. So one problem here is that if modern day society failed in any kind of spectacular way and we lost most modern electrical infrastructure, I don't know about you, but I, for one, would really struggle with hunter-gatherer times or even agrarian times. I've done a little bit of weeding and a little bit of gardening in my life, but definitely not enough to actually run a full-scale farm. I'm sure I adapt to some extent. But in prior times, people had a much easier time because they often were agrarian. They lived their lives on farms and they often weren't dependent upon the state to a large extent. While now we are much more highly specialized and we're also much more dependent upon state infrastructure as well. So, which I think is good in many ways, but it also does make us more susceptible when the state undergoes a downfall and critical systems collapse. I think on top of that is we now have much more potent weapons, which is one of the problems of a collapse is you often lose the government, which is supposed to hold a kind of legitimate monopoly on violence. And if that happens, weaponry becomes more democratized, you often do see heightened rates of violence, not in all cases, but in many. And that was not fine, but it was bearable when you had muskets or swords. But now when we have potentially biological engineered weapons in the future, that becomes a much more precarious situation. And of course, on top of that, as mentioned before, we're much more interconnected now. And this is the most interesting message of Eric Klein's book, is that he draws a parallel between the Bronze Age civilizations and the modern world. Because in the Bronze Age, civilizations in the Aegean and Mediterranean were deeply interconnected. We call them the Bronze Age because they traded heavily in both tin and copper, which are the prerequisites for bronze as an alloy. And they also were very deeply connected diplomatically and politically. They intermarried a fair amount. They gave a huge amount of gifts to each other. And so when one society fell, it automatically had very large effects across the rest. And I think we're stuck in the same situation right now as well. Particularly if you have any member of the G20 collapse, that's going to have massive knock-on effects. And we see this quite clear in the global financial crisis back in 2008. A housing bubble in the US essentially caused a great recession. That itself is really quite striking. So I think in many ways we do have better recovery mechanisms. I don't think we're using them insofar as there's no global plan to recover society, civilization in the case of the collapse. But we also have, I think, a much more precarious position now because people are less capable of returning to simpler lifestyles. We have much worse weaponry and technology at our disposal. And we have a much more complex interconnected system as well. And one thing I should mention on top of all this is that trying to actually reboot will be more difficult because most technology that surrounds us is incomprehensible to us. Studies show that people, even when asked to explain how a zipper works, usually fail, let alone the conductors that are inside your computer, for example.
No, that's true. I mean, I don't remember whether they still do that, but when I was getting my driver license several years back, over 20 years now, we used to go sort of course you have to have the exam and whatnot, but part of the exam was quite a detailed exam about the engine and then how it works, so what parts are doing what, and if certain a valve fails, how we can change it, where is it, it's written, it's a test, so it's not practical, but we did learn about it when we were getting our license. We had to read and understand, and at least when I open up the the boot, I could get a sense of what works and how and so on and so forth. I'm not sure they're doing it anymore, for instance. In that sense, certain things that used to be our parents, grandparents take it for granted to do. We're not doing that, and under such a collapse, that would be actually, most of us would not be in any shape or form to be able to adapt into the new reality, and that's not good.
Yeah, we definitely didn't have to learn how to use the engine when it came to learning how to drive in Australia. We barely had to learn the road rules. So, I mean, a lot of this then depends on. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so I think it's a good point to sort of pivot to some of your research. I recently read your paper with Catherine Ruthers, which I did interview a couple of weeks ago for this as well. On the cartography of global catastrophic governance, and so one of the messages that I think is coming out of this talk as well is that the importance of international governance and cooperation aspects of it. Could you tell us a little bit about that paper and what you tried to achieve and what was the main message?
So the purpose of the paper was to try to map out the different governance arrangements we have across a range of different global catastrophic risks. So nuclear war, asteroid strikes, biological engineered pandemics more broadly, climate change, environmental degradation, the drivers behind them as well. So we also did look at inequality, and also kind of more broader arrangements around foresight. And we did so fairly simply, just by looking at what was available in terms of data on the different institutions. Luckily, Catherine already has a really deep knowledge about the kind of biological regime in particular, the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as the Convention on Biological Weapons and Chemical Weapons. Well, I have a pretty good knowledge on most environmental regimes. So we had a fairly good base to work from, and apart from that, it was just then about going into the literature and going onto UN websites, etc., and trying to map these all out into big systems maps. And the key things we found was that most regimes which are operating are probably not ready to actually deal with a large-scale catastrophe. So even much more well-developed regimes, like in climate change, for example. While the climate change regime, the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and its associated bodies, has been in existence for over 2 decades. It has never had a particular work stream or focus upon the catastrophic risks, the kind of tail risks.
Interesting.
One could argue, of course, that this happens in a kind of implicit fashion, that we're aware that things could spiral into 6 degrees, and that's why we've put 2 degrees as a kind of guardrail. But most adaptation and most mitigation programs don't really think in this kind of fat-tailed risk scenario.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, even when you look at modeling, for example, so most of the modeling that's drawn upon for trying to project temperature change going into the future don't have the actual feedback loops in the system. So don't take into account that there's going to be a reduced albedo, the reflexivity of the Earth as we lose the polar ice caps, nor much more kind of nuanced feedback loops. So what we've seen recently is boreal forests, so basically the forests which line the polar regions. They've been having massive bark beetle attacks, which has basically decreased their forest coverage. Forests do take up carbon. We've seen increased and intense fires throughout both obviously Australia, but also the Amazon. And these are all essentially feedback loops, which worsen with climate change, but in turn worsen climate change. And in most cases, they're not incorporated into models. And when we do have models which do incorporate such feedback loops, they tend to end up with much worse results. So the latest assessment report from the IPCC is likely to have a suite of climate models called the CMIP6, which will probably end up with temperature range roughly 0.4 to 0.9 degrees Celsius higher than the previous reports. And at least from what I've heard from insiders, that seems to largely come down to upgraded modeling of both atmospheric aerosol forcing as well as clouds. So previously, there was this very large belief that clouds would act as what you call negative feedback, that actually balance. So as you had increased precipitation, that would form more clouds that would actually prevent solar radiation hitting the Earth. But we haven't actually seen that happen. And there's some evidence that at higher temperature ranges, so once you get to 6 degrees or 8 degrees and above, you actually have a breakup of cloud formation around the tropics, which could potentially create this really runaway positive feedback loop. So in short, we don't take either the feedbacks nor the higher temperature range scenario that seriously, either in the governance or in the science as much, which is kind of understandable. The science follows the lead of the governance. And in this case, we've basically pegged 2 flags at 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, since that's where most of the kind of analysis has gone around. But what I'd like to see in the future is obviously something like a tail risk treaty, where you look at early warning signals that we're going to be hitting certain tipping points, and you can ramp up international commitments in the light of that. But climate change isn't alone in not looking at these kind of more catastrophic scenarios. Most other regimes don't have a kind of explicit focus upon tail risks. The UN system itself doesn't have any kind of foresight mechanisms for looking at catastrophic risks, nor any foresight more broadly usually. Some particular international institutions do. The World Health Organization, for example, is setting up a foresight mechanism. But we also know there's certain areas which don't have any governance whatsoever. And that was one of the interesting things. So when you look at artificial intelligence, for example, there's a patchwork of different covering things like lethal autonomous weapons, that's covered by the conventional weapons. The ITU hosts its regular AI for Good summits. We have the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. So there's kind of this archipelago of different things. The IMO and the ICAO, International Civil Aviation Authority, all have their own particular programs on unmanned vehicles and drones, for example. But none of them are actually linked together in any kind of way. So there's no international convention on AI. And likewise, when it comes to geoengineering is partially covered by different bits and pieces, so most prominently the NMOD Convention on Environmental Modification, but that only regulates the use of geoengineering as a weapon.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of three key lessons we took from this cartography, this mapping of the different governance, was that there are a number of risks, such as climate change, which are covered by international governance, but the risk of them being a catastrophe is usually not. There's a number of risks which are not covered whatsoever, so geoengineering being an example, or only partially covered. And there's a number of kind of key mechanisms which are not covered by the international governance system. And foresight's one of the big ones here, as is recovery as well.
So that seems to be actually a good opportunity for a lot of institutional design to be able to attack that. But of course, the one of the biggest sort of dilemmas or the issues is how are you going to align the incentives of the actors to actually engage in this institutional design? And someone who looked at this, particularly the governance mechanisms, quite in detail. What do you think about sort of aligning the incentives, particularly with the policymakers and politicians, to make these institutional designs and take it more seriously? And that seems to me is one of the key issues, together with explaining these tail risks to the broader public who doesn't necessarily have intuitive feel of thinking about these. The second issue is how to get the policymakers to act on it, even if they think this is serious.
Yeah, so I think this is a very deep problem because incentives, to me, are highly influenced by political economy.
Yeah.
Very influenced by my experiences here in the climate regime, where I think we've been unfortunately fixated upon this idea that climate change is a prisoner's dilemma, that whoever acts first is going to lose out, and then stuck in this bind of you go first, no, you go first. And I think that framing is largely a myth, and it's one that's largely been perpetuated by the fossil fuel industry. When you look at the costs, what we call the kind of co-benefits of mitigation, the costs of fossil fuels, they end up being astronomical. Roughly 9 million people every year die from air pollution, which is largely attributable to fossil fuels. We have large costs in terms of the volatility of fossil fuels. Think about back to the 1970s when we had the oil crisis, where basically OPEC jacked up the prices in response to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that caused chaos essentially throughout international markets. So energy security and volatility is another big issue. And all of these would be largely mitigated if you reduced your dependence on fossil fuels and increased renewable energy. And of course, there's a whole lot of other benefits to renewable energy, creating potentially a new driver of economic growth, new different kinds of often better jobs. And we know that even if you didn't think about all these co-benefits, the actual cost of reducing emissions is incredibly low. I did a reports with an economist, Frank Yotso, who's one of the lead authors on IPCC Working Group 3. And we looked at basically all the existing studies that have been done on how much it would cost Australia to heavily decarbonise or decarbonise entirely by 2050. And it ends up being roughly 0.1% of GDP growth. So that's not GDP, that's GDP growth.
Really?
Yeah, just a business load. The fact that we're having a massive policy debate about whether to do this is just beggars belief. And importantly, like with climate modelling, which doesn't consider feedback loops, this modelling doesn't consider the co-benefits. It doesn't consider all the lives you'd save, all the increased worker productivity. And these can be massive. We know when we looked retrospectively at the Clean Air Act during the 1990s from the US, the benefits of that outweigh the cost of compliance by roughly 20 to 1. And this is actually quite common when you look across environmental regulations. Industry basically makes that it's going to be catastrophic, it's going to be a wrecking ball throughout the economy, but it ends up the actual benefits usually outweigh the costs when you look at it in a holistic way. And I think that's one of the problems we have, is that when you think about aligning incentives, you're basically thinking about how do you change in many ways the cost benefit calculations of different actors. And right now, that is heavily being influenced by industry groups who usually have a vested interest to keep these things going. So climate change is the fossil fuel industry. For nuclear weapons, it's basically a military industrial complex. So this is one of the problems, is we have to think about how do you address these political economy issues before you can really properly align the incentives of different actors. And to me, this requires, I think, fairly drastic changes in the way we do democracy. I think if, for example, we move towards what's called deliberative democracy, where essentially you have a return back to how democracy was done in ancient Greek times. You do a lottery across your population, you have a number of different people elected, they get briefed by experts, and then make a decision, which could also be balanced out by referendum as well. But we know from studies that are done on this, it actually works fairly well. That even if you get, for example, far-right people in this kind of deliberative assembly, they end up actually shifting their beliefs quite well in response to new evidence and expertise. And if you buffer this appropriately against the kind of wider political economy, against lobbying from different industries to be affected, etc., I think this would change obviously change both policy making drastically, but it also change the way we think about interests and what the incentives are as well. So I think to me, this is one of the biggest ones, is that it doesn't actually require any major changes in terms of thinking long-term. I think we actually can think long-term much of the time. We do it when it comes to insurance. We've done it when it comes to cathedral building as well. A lot of it comes to addressing the political economy interests, which are preventing us from taking catastrophic risks seriously.
Yeah, I think sure.
Sorry, it's gardening time here in Australia.
Yeah, okay. No, I mean, that's since Monster Olson wrote this collective action, what was it, 1965? Was it the book?
Yeah.
We have that special interests dominating that, and I think sort of returning to deliberative democracy is, I think, definitely one way to deal with it. But I think that also needs to be accompanied by a more sort of localized or relocalization of a lot of the governance and authority structures as well. I think for that to work, with a very highly centralized system, that's not going to work. What some call radical localization, I think, is one possible way to think about it, I guess.
Yeah, and this actually meshes pretty well when you think about what makes any complex system anti-fragile.
Exactly.
And this way is a step beyond resilience. It's about actually becoming stronger from any kind of shock to the system. So resilience, you can basically be robust with shocks. So a blade of grass, for example, can bend and spring back. A tree can obviously just withstand the wind. But anti-fragility is something closer to what living systems undergo. So if you lift a weight, afterwards you become stronger. You'll be able to lift more weight.
And Nassim Taleb has been hammering this for a while. And exactly. So I think, and one of his sort of pet peeves is also the whole localism debate, I think. And he is in that sense, right.
Yeah. He has this big term of fractal localism, where you basically similar arrangements to a local level, and they kind of follow a fractal pattern of expanding outwards from there. Which I do think this would go a long way to making the world more anti-fragile. If you had a certain degree of localization, that would make more modular systems. So even if one local government does something really bad with technology, it's unlikely to spread. Particularly because most of the very large catastrophic risks we're looking at with technology, it basically requires a huge concentration of resources. Manhattan project style things, which is less likely to happen in the world of localized economies. I do think there's still a very large problem here, and that's thinking about if you do have these kind of more modular, localized economic systems, how eventually do you address international coordination? So you notice an asteroid coming towards Earth, how do you make sure that all the local economies effectively discuss this in time to potentially put a deflection system? And this is something that I haven't heard Taleb or others really put forward a convincing response yet, and it's something I'd be interested in looking at more in the future. But I do think this is one of the most prominent challenges of our time, is trying to think about how to make the world more anti-fragile, how to make sure that some critical systems aren't too deeply interconnected, but to make sure that we're not becoming too self-isolated either. I think that even when we want to localize well, we still want a certain degree of globalization as well. I think the beauty of globalization is it does bring people from different cultures and economies more closely together, and it does make international coordination easier as well. So how we bridge that gap, how we make the world more modular, but also more resilient to and responsive to international and global problems, is one of the defining challenges of our time. It will take much international relations, will take complexity science and many other things as well.
That's definitely the $6 million question. I think that might
Yeah.
be a useful way to pivot to sort of one thing I sort of want to get at is this is quite a new field in the sense of very
Yeah.
interdisciplinary, but it's also a young field. And what advice would you give to the master's students or someone young researchers who are interested in it and want to get involved in this area? What kind of skills they need to sort of learn and focus on? What promising avenues for research out there when you look at from now?
Good question. I think that historically our subfield's been dominated by both analytical philosophers, as well as to a lesser extent, I think increasingly economists as well. I think that I would give less advice related to here's a particular subject or discipline you should take on. I think there's a large number of different ones which could be applicable. I think there's some which are heavily underrepresented, such as probably anthropology, history, and law would be big ones. But to me, dealing with catastrophic risk is actually much less about the discipline you come from and more about mindset and skills you take to it. And so in this case, it's a willingness to, I think, read very, very widely across both different risks, but also across different areas as well. So, the things I've been talking about today around normal accidents, as well as complex systems, for example, anti-fragility, etc. Those are things which are not discretely about global catastrophic risks. But I find by reading widely, you can basically take topics that become heavily relatable to or relevant to global catastrophic risks. So I think that's one thing, is just making sure you're widely read and interdisciplinary by nature. And the second one would be making sure there's a certain degree of modesty and humbleness as well, and that you do actually go back to the experts when it comes to different things. And it's one thing I've learned from my SATL CLAPS research is I often make sure to go and do an idiot check. So whenever I think I have a thought which might be useful, I make sure to actually run it by a whole bunch of anthropologists and archaeologists beforehand. So I think this is useful as well, as taking a certain degree of modesty when you're trying to take on these very large, grand interdisciplinary endeavors, and making sure that you're widely read across different topics and areas and skill sets. But to be honest, I think they're also just the markers of what makes a good scholar, not necessarily what makes a good GC.
Exactly. I mean, I totally agree with all of these points. The disciplinary, the wide sort of reading when you start seeing the connections. My own sort of foray into the field was mostly through the thinking about probabilistic, judgment and forecasting, and through there, and then Taleb and others, and then you see connections out there, and okay, let's go there. And science fiction apparently also plays a lot of role for a lot of people. I think, including myself too. So you start thinking about it. So I mean, the broader sort of our toolboxes, I think, the more useful it is. I want to sort of very quickly wrap up with talking a little bit about naturally COVID-19 and what this particular pandemic can tell us more broadly about some of these risks out there. I mean, this is not an existential risk or a global catastrophic risk, even perhaps. It is a dry run to how we can deal with these emergencies. So what does that tell us about the resiliency of the system, or our ability to coordinate and recover? And what the work on existential risk can tell us about how to deal with this particular crisis today?
Good questions. So first, I agree with you. I think this is more of a warning shot for a dress rehearsal. One of the key points of debate I've heard in the field is about whether or not we do get warning shots. So whether this is a case where you have abrupt catastrophes, which just take everyone out, or whether you're likely to have smaller catastrophes, which basically trigger institutions to change and prepare for these kinds of things. Because when you look at most large-scale events of this kind, whether it's pandemics or even, for example, warfare, they tend to follow a power law distribution. So where you have an order magnitude higher impact, it tends to be an order magnitude less frequency. And I think this is possibly a good example of that, where this is a kind of impact, which is going to hopefully prime systems towards being more prepared for pandemics in the future. And arguably seen this to a certain extent where the countries who've been hit by swine flu, avian flu, and SARS were the ones who were probably best prepared for COVID as well. Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, etc. Arguably that didn't filter through the international system because the international system itself probably wasn't very prepared for this. In terms of what this says about the resilience of society, I think this shows that, first of all, our economic fixation on efficiency is good in the best of times, but it is catastrophic in the worst.
Exactly.
It's whatsoever. You want to have supply chains which actually have buffers, which have redundancies, which are actually slow in many cases. So I think this is hopefully going to change the kind of economic logic we have around institutions. I think we've also found that while there's a lot of talk about neoliberalism, about making governments lean and efficient, and also about globalization, making sure that we always are shipping our products to basically the lowest cost market, that again falls apart pretty quickly in a catastrophe, where all of a sudden countries have become like turtles. They've automatically retracted into their shells at the first sign of danger. And on top of that, in order to actually keep the economy going and to keep society coherent, we've had to automatically revert back to higher levels of government intervention.
Mm-hmm.
So this is saying some very interesting things about what's our kind of default conditions we go back towards when a catastrophe starts to hit. I think in terms of resilience, it also shows us that, again, hyperconnectivity has a cost, particularly when it comes to something like a pandemic. And a lot of the other questions about resilience, we can't answer now because it really depends upon how the knock-on effects of this occur. If we have, for example, an economic recession or depression that is long-lasting and potentially results in very negative, either diplomatic, political, or even violent changes, that's obviously something to take into account. So it's hard to tell at this stage. I think, like with the French Revolution, it's just too early to say anything useful. I think that one worrying trend I've seen so far has been that the automatic response of many countries has been to increase surveillance and increase citizens. And this is entirely expected insofar as there's a large literature on this idea of emergency powers, that whenever exceptional circumstance, particular danger, countries will usually do their best to enact emergency powers, which they can use to drastically kind of address the problem. But these emergency powers tend to become sticky. The exception fairly quickly. We know this looking at 9/11. 9/11 led to what was called the Total Information Awareness Program by DARPA, which was essentially one of their attempts to create basically a very large-scale AI system that would take in multiple different data streams all the way from CCTV through to credit card usage and basically use that to monitor citizens real time. That was eventually scrapped because they did really bad marketing. Actually, when they announced the program, the logo for the program was literally a triangle, like the triangle of the eye you see on the back of the $1 bill, except for the eye was acting as a searchlight over a globe. Whoever did that in the marketing department, I hope they got fired immediately. Anyway, a good thing, but eventually...
They should have just go and call it Panopticon and then be done with it as well, and just to make you...
Honesty is a virtue, right? That eventually led to the NSA's PRISM program, which is the one that Edward Snowden explained so long ago. So we do know that crises tend to create these window of opportunities in which governments tend to create more control for themselves. And we've seen this so far when it comes to COVID. We've had at least 3 countries do internet shutdowns. A broad number of them have started to do contact tracing apps, I think roughly 15 at least. Australia has its own contact tracing app right now, which there's been discussions about making that mandatory. We've obviously seen particular leaders do very, very draconian measures. So Hungary's Orbán has basically made himself capable of ruling by decree for an indefinite period of time. And the problem I have here is, of course, that in most of these cases, we don't actually know if these measures are going to help. So contact tracing apps, the Ada Lovelace Institute in the UK did a rapid review and basically found that there's a lack of evidence to suggest these will be useful. There's a good chance they actually may degrade trust between governments and citizens. And also there's probably going to be a lack of precision when using Bluetooth technology as well. And of course, these are less likely to be useful unless you're doing widespread testing, which in the case of places like the UK, they're not.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And definitely when it comes to certain things like giving police immunity, which has happened in Peru, police have now been basically given no criminal liability for any acts of violence that occurred during the pandemic. That's definitely, I don't see any way how that's going to help either pandemic preparedness or response. And this actually links pretty well in some cases to what actually GCR scholars are talking about, not always in a good way. So Nick Bostrom, for example, one of the big prominent scholars in our field, has had this idea of the vulnerable world hypothesis, where basically says, there's different technologies which could ruin civilization by default. He gives the example of easily made nukes. So imagine just run electricity between two pieces of glass and that creates a nuclear explosion. And given this, we should probably turn towards our best shot of addressing this will probably be turning towards a turnkey totalitarianism, where we basically have a high-tech panopticon, which constantly surveys citizens to make sure they're not building any really dangerous technologies. And if they do, they're immediately interfered with. I think the problem I have with this is, well, obviously it's built on a thought experiment. But when you actually look at something like COVID, which is a much more practical example, the reason it's occurred and the reason it's spread have not been because of citizen negligence. It's been because of the poor decision-making of governments. The fact that China suppressed much of the initial information in cases, the WHO and others were very, very slow to react. In places like the UK, we obviously had hampered and delayed responses and a lack of transparency about how decisions were actually being made around herd immunity. And on top of all this was the fact that we knew this was coming, but we couldn't address the political economy problems that underlie things like wet markets, poaching, as even, for example, factory farming, which is likely to result in much worse than the pandemic through antibiotic resistance. So all of these are kind of like very large problems of hierarchical institutions, and yet automatic reflex is to reinforce the hierarchy and monitor citizens much more closely. And in the long term, this is what really worries me both at the start of risk as well as our response to catastrophes, is that even if it doesn't result in human extinction, it results in a dystopia, which no one really wants to live.
I mean, also one of my problems with Bostrom's argument about the one world debate is that, and I think that's why it's very important to have other disciplines, particularly anthropology, coming through this, is the sort of the ignoring the whole pushback and clever ways in which the people would react and try to circumvent that. I mean, the classic works of James Scott and the Weapons of the Weak, and exactly. Seeing like a state. The moment the state or the authorities start developing these mechanisms to control and measure and survey, the people find ways to push back and derail and so on and so forth. So that's why I think in the field we do need that perspective. I mean, back in grad school, I'm not a comparative politics person, but Jim Scott's books, both Seeing Like a State as well as The Weapons of the Weak, are among my favorite books because it gives you such a clear perspective on this particular dynamic nature and the folly of grand designs. Right. So to me, that's fascinating.
I'm so glad you mentioned him because he's probably both my academic crush and the closest thing I have to some kind of an academic idol. Very, very valid points. And I think that interesting when you look at Bostrom's examples of things like nukes, he also brings up the examples of, a scientific experiment gone wrong. So imagine we use a large hadron collider and that creates a miniature. All of these are, again, examples of hierarchies and institutions gone wrong, not of your kind of everyday terrorist or person gone wrong. And I think this is, again, one of the problems we have in existential risk is that when we think of agential risks, we think of the lone terrorist gunman, we think of the kind of omnicidal or ecocidal terrorist agency. We don't think of DARPA, we don't think of the US military, the ones who historically have been the roots of things like lethal autonomous weapons, nuclear weapons, etc., etc. So I agree. I think bringing anthropology in and bringing political economy in, bringing the kind of like broader disciplines that are underrepresented in, would change drastically the way we think about GCRs.
Excellent. Luke, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate taking the time that you take the time to come on. I really enjoyed the chat. I wish we could go on for a while, but also want people to be able to watch this. Otherwise, we'll go for hours. But so thank you very much. Thanks for coming on. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me, Balkan.